The frost came early that year, settling over Cedar Hollow like something that had decided to stay. Mara Ellison stood at her kitchen window watching it creep across the glass in thin silver lines, and she thought, not for the first time, that the cold had a way of finding every crack in a house. Every crack in a person, too. She'd been awake since 4. Couldn't sleep past it anymore. Not since Daniel died. Not since the bed got too wide and the silence got too loud. So she did what she always did. She cooked. Flour dust hung in the kitchen light like fog, and her hands moved through the motions with a kind of muscle memory that didn't need her heart to be in it. Biscuit dough. Roasted chicken, the good kind, the kind she used to make for Sunday dinners when there were people to eat it. Apple pie with a lattice top she'd practiced for 2 hours until the strips laid even. It was for the auction. The Christmas basket auction, same as every year, the one event Cedar Hollow took more pride in than the 4th of July parade. Families spent weeks preparing baskets. Fried chicken, cornbread, preserves, pies. And the bachelors and ranchers of the county would bid on them, sometimes $20, $30. Money that went to the church roof fund or the school's new books. It was supposed to be fun. Charming. A tradition. For Mara, it had become something closer to a public flogging. She set the pie on the windowsill to cool and looked at her reflection in the dark glass. 41 years old. Gray threading through her dark hair at the temples now, lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago. She used to think she looked like her mother. Now she thought she looked like a woman who'd been rained on too many times and never quite dried out. Last basket, she said out loud to nobody because there was nobody to say it to. Last one. After this, I'm done. She didn't believe herself. Not really. She'd said that last year, too. By the time she walked into town, the frost had burned off into a hard blue sky, the kind of cold, clear December morning that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Cedar Hollow wasn't a big town. One main street, a feed store, a dry goods shop, a church with a white steeple that needed paint, a saloon that did double duty as a meeting hall when the occasion called for it. Everybody knew everybody. That was supposed to be the good part of small towns. Nobody had ever told Mara that everybody knowing everybody also meant everybody remembering. She remembered too. She remembered when she walked these same streets on Daniel's arm, when people waved at her from porches, when Mrs. Calloway used to save her the good peaches at the dry goods store. She remembered being somebody's wife, somebody's neighbor, somebody who belonged. Then Daniel got thrown from a horse 2 winters back, hit his head on a fence post, and was gone before the doctor even got there. And somewhere in the months after, grief had turned Mara into something the town didn't know what to do with. A widow with no children. A woman alone. A woman who didn't cry pretty, who didn't fade quietly into the background the way grieving widows were supposed to, who instead kept showing up. At church, at the market, at every town function. Like she still had a right to be there. They didn't forgive her for that. She wasn't even sure what there was to forgive. But she'd stopped trying to understand it a long time ago. Morning, Mara. She turned. It was Ruth Pemberton, coming out of the dry goods store with a basket of her own. A beautiful one, ribbon-tied, smelling of cinnamon even from a few feet away. Morning, Ruth, Mara said, and managed a smile. Ruth looked at Mara's basket, the plain cloth covering it, and something flickered across her face. Not quite a smirk. Not quite kindness either. You're entering again this year? I am. Ruth adjusted her own basket on her hip. Well, good luck. The way she said good luck made it clear she meant the opposite. Mara had heard that tone enough times to know exactly what it meant. It meant nobody's going to bid on yours, but bless your heart for trying. She kept walking. The town hall was already filling up by the time Mara arrived, baskets lined up on long tables at the front, ribbons and bows catching the light streaming through the tall windows. Children ran between the rows of chairs. Men in their good coats stood near the back, talking business, sizing up which baskets belonged to which families, calculating which young women they might impress with a generous bid. The smell of cooked food and wood smoke and cheap cologne filled the room. Mara set her basket down at the end of the table, away from the others, the way she always did now. Not because anyone told her to. She just knew where she wasn't wanted, and she'd learned to save herself, and everyone else, the discomfort. You came back, said a voice behind her. She didn't have to turn around to know it was Florence Whitaker. Florence ran the church auxiliary and considered herself the moral compass of Cedar Hollow, a job she'd appointed herself to with great enthusiasm. "I did," Mara said, turning to face her anyway. Florence's eyes went to the basket, then back to Mara's face, then to the basket again, like she was doing arithmetic she didn't like the answer to. "Well, I suppose persistence is a virtue. I suppose it is, though some might call it something else." Florence's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Stubbornness, perhaps." Mara held her gaze. "I prefer persistence." Florence's mouth tightened, but she didn't have a response ready, so she simply turned and walked off toward the front of the room, where the auctioneer, old Mr. Higgins, who'd been calling this auction for 30 years, was setting up his podium. Mara exhaled slowly. Her hands had gone cold despite the warmth of the hall, and she pressed them together, willing them to stop shaking. "You knew this would happen," she told herself. "You knew exactly what this would be. She'd known, and she'd come anyway. Because somewhere underneath the hurt, there was something stubborn in her. Florence wasn't wrong about that part. Something that refused to let this town decide she didn't exist anymore." The auction began a little after 10, with Higgins clearing his throat into a borrowed megaphone, and the crowd settling into rows of folding chairs with the particular hush of people who took their entertainment seriously. "Now, folks, you know how this works," Higgins called out, grinning beneath his gray mustache. "Every dollar goes toward the new roof for the schoolhouse, so dig deep. And remember, you're not just buying supper, you're buying yourself an evening with the lady who made it." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Somewhere in the back, a baby started crying and was quickly hushed. The first basket went up, belonged to the Caldwell girl, 18 years old and pretty as a postcard, her basket done up with red ribbon and sprigs of holly. The bidding started at $2 and climbed fast, young ranch hands elbowing each other for the chance, the room laughing and hollering as the price went up to $11 before a blushing young man named Tom Hardesty won it, to general applause. Basket after basket went the same way. Some went for less. The older women, the married ones whose husbands simply bought their own baskets back with a wink, everybody in on the joke. Some went for a great deal more, especially the unmarried young women, whose baskets were less about the food and more about a socially sanctioned excuse to spend an evening together. Mara sat near the back, hands folded in her lap, watching it all with the strange, detached calm of someone observing a play they already knew the ending to. Ruth Pemberton's basket went for $9, to a rancher's son who'd clearly had his eye on her for months. Florence Whitaker's basket, though Florence was a married woman and everyone knew her husband would buy it, still fetched a generous bid, accompanied by the kind of indulgent laughter reserved for a community's most respected members. And then Higgins reached the end of the table, picked up the next basket, and read the small card tucked beneath the ribbon. "Mar Ellison," he announced. The room didn't go silent exactly. It went quiet in a different way. A shifting, a rustling, a few muffled snickers passed between rows. Someone near the front murmured something Mara couldn't quite hear, and the people around them laughed under their breath. "Well now," Higgins said, a little too heartily, the way a man does when he's trying to paper over an awkward moment. "Who'll start the bidding? Plain basket, but I hear she's a fine cook." Silence. Mara kept her chin up, her eyes fixed somewhere on the back wall, on a spot just above everyone's heads. She'd practiced this. She'd practiced not looking at anyone, not giving them the satisfaction of seeing her face fall. "Come on now," Higgins tried again, shifting his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "Surely somebody—" "I'll bid a nickel," called a voice from the middle rows, and the room erupted into laughter. Mara felt the heat climb up her neck and into her face. She kept her eyes forward. "Don't react. Don't give them anything." Now," Higgins said, though he was smiling despite himself. "That's hardly—" "Save your money, Higgins," someone else called out. "Everybody knows that basket'll come with a side of ghost stories." More laughter, louder this time, rolling through the hall in waves. Mara dug her fingernails into her palms beneath the folds of her skirt. She thought about Daniel, about how he used to say, "Don't you let anybody make you small, Mara. You were never meant to be small." She thought about the months after the funeral, the casseroles that stopped coming, the invitations that dried up, the way she'd walk into church and feel the room's attention slide off her like she was made of something nobody wanted to touch. She thought about all the nights she'd cried into a pillow that still, stupidly, smelled like him for the first 6 months, and how she'd promised herself she would not let this town turn her into someone who hid. "Anybody?" Higgins asked again, scanning the crowd, and Mara could hear the apology in his voice even though he wasn't the one who owed her one. Nobody raised a hand. "Going once," Higgins said, his voice quieter now, almost reluctant. Mara stared at the back wall. "Don't cry. Don't you dare cry in front of these people." "Going $50. The voice came from the back of the hall, low and even, cutting through the room like a blade through butter. Every head turned at once. Mara turned too, and for a moment she couldn't place who'd spoken because she didn't recognize the man standing near the door, hat in hand, dressed in a dark wool coat that had clearly cost more than every other coat in the room combined. "I'm sorry," Higgins said, blinking. "Did you say $50? The man repeated, stepping forward, his boots loud against the wood floor in the silence that had swallowed the whole hall. "For the basket." A murmur swept through the crowd, sharp with disbelief. $50 was more than triple the highest bid of the entire morning. Florence Whitaker's basket, and she was practically town royalty, had only gone for 14. "Sir," Higgins said, recovering himself, clearly delighted despite his confusion. "Might I ask your name? I don't believe Grant Mercer." The man came further into the light, and now Mara could see him properly. Tall, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his late 30s, with a face that had clearly spent a lot of time outdoors, weathered and serious, dark eyes that swept the room once before landing, finally, on her. "Mercer," someone in the crowd whispered. "The rancher? From up past Hollis Ridge?" "That's 100 acres of cattle land," someone else murmured. "Heard he's worth more than half this town put together." Mara felt her pulse hammering in her throat. She had no idea who this man was. She'd never seen him before in her life, as far as she could remember. And yet he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something steady, something almost gentle, entirely at odds with the circus the room had become. $50, going once, Higgins called, grinning now like Christmas had come early in more ways than one. "Going twice, sold, to Mr. Grant Mercer, for the Ellison basket." A scattering of applause, mostly confused, a few outright stunned faces. Florence Whitaker's mouth had fallen open slightly, and Ruth Pemberton was staring at Mara like she'd never seen her before. Mara sat frozen in her chair as Grant Mercer crossed the room toward her, every eye in the hall following him. He stopped in front of her and extended a hand, not to shake hers, but simply held out, palm up, an invitation. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. His voice was quieter now, just for her, though half the room was straining to hear anyway. "I believe that basket's mine. I'd be obliged if you'd join me while I eat it." Mara stared up at him. I'm sorry, do I know you?" Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but close to it. "You don't remember me. I suppose that's fair. It was dark, and you were more concerned with my skull than my face." She blinked. "I'm sorry?" 3 years back, spring storm, out past the county line. A man got thrown from his horse on the Miller Road, hit his head bad enough he couldn't see straight, couldn't remember his own name. A woman found him, half frozen, dragged him into her wagon, and got him to a doctor 12 miles away before the bleeding in his skull killed him. He paused. "Doctor said another half hour and I wouldn't have made it." Mara's breath caught. The memory rose up slow, like something surfacing from deep water. A man on the side of the road, blood matting his dark hair, the panic of trying to lift him, the long, terrified ride into town with him slumping against her shoulder, mumbling things that made no sense. She'd never learned his name. He'd been unconscious by the time they reached the doctor's office, and she'd left before he woke, because Daniel had been waiting for her at home and worrying himself sick. "That was you," she said softly. "That was me." Grant's jaw tightened slightly. "I asked around after. Nobody could tell me who'd found me. By the time I was well enough to go looking, you'd disappeared back into whatever life you had. I never got the chance to thank you properly." The room had gone very quiet, listening to every word, and Mara felt suddenly, acutely aware of all the eyes on her. But for the first time in 2 years, the attention didn't feel like a blade. "You didn't need to spend $50 to thank me," she said, and was surprised to hear something like humor in her own voice, thin and rusty from disuse. "No," Grant agreed. "I didn't." His eyes held hers steady. "I spent it because I heard the way this room was talking before I bid, and I figured somebody who'd save a stranger's life on the side of a road in a storm deserved better than to sit here and be laughed at." Somewhere behind Mara, she heard Florence Whitaker make a small, strangled sound, like she'd swallowed something unpleasant. "Will you join me, Mrs. Ellison?" Grant asked again, hand still extended. "I'd very much like to actually taste this basket. Everyone seems so determined to mock." Mara looked at his hand, looked up at his face, weathered and serious and entirely sincere. Looked around the room, at all the faces she'd known her whole life, faces that had spent 2 years deciding she wasn't worth a kind word, and something in her chest, something that had been clenched tight for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to loosen, finally let go. She placed her hand in his. "I will," she said. Contempt. They walked out of the town hall together, the whole room watching, and Mara was fairly certain she heard Florence Whitaker whisper something about indecent haste before the door swung shut behind them. But for once in 2 years, she didn't care. Outside, the cold air bit at her cheeks, and Grant walked beside her with an easy, unhurried pace, the picnic basket tucked under one arm like it weighed nothing. "There's a bench by the church," he said. "If you don't mind the cold." "I don't mind," Mara said. "I think I prefer it honestly. Quieter out here." He gave a short laugh, low in his throat. "I imagine it is, compared to in there." They walked in silence for a moment, their breath fogging in the air between them. Mara stole a glance at him sideways, the strong line of his jaw, the small white scar near his temple that she now understood must have come from that night, the steady, unhurried way he carried himself, like a man who'd never once had to raise his voice to be heard. "Why'd you really do that?" she asked, when they reached the bench and he set the basket down between them. "The $50. You could have just thanked me quietly, found me after, said your piece, gone home." Grant considered this question for a long moment before he answered, unwrapping the cloth from the basket, revealing the chicken, the biscuits, the pie, still slightly warm. "Honestly," he said, "I almost did. Was going to let it pass, just watch the auction, find you after when there weren't so many eyes around." He paused, pulling a biscuit free, turning it over in his hands without eating it yet. "But then I heard them laughing, heard some fella offer you a nickel like it was the funniest thing he'd said all week. And I thought about you out there in that storm, soaked through, half my weight, hauling me into a wagon because you weren't going to let a stranger die on the side of the road." He looked up at her. "And I figured if this town didn't know what you were worth, somebody ought to show them." Mara felt something hot prickle behind her eyes and blinked it back fiercely. She would not cry. Not now. Not after holding it together through the whole humiliating auction. "That's a kind thing to say," she managed. "It's not kindness." Grant broke the biscuit in half, handed her one piece. "It's the truth. There's a difference." She took the biscuit, their fingers brushing for half a second, and something about the simple, ordinary warmth of his hand made her chest ache in a way she hadn't felt in 2 years. "You haven't even tasted it yet," she said, nodding at the biscuit. "Might want to reserve judgment." Grant smiled, really smiled this time, the expression transforming his weathered face into something boyish, almost. He took a bite. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully, and Mara found herself holding her breath like a fool. Like his opinion of her biscuits actually mattered. Like 2 years of being told she was nothing hadn't already convinced her she had nothing worth offering anyone. "Lord," Grant said, and then caught himself, shook his head slightly. "Sorry. I mean, that might be the best biscuit I've had since my mother passed." Mara laughed, surprised at the sound of it, surprised at how unfamiliar it felt in her own throat, like a language she'd forgotten how to speak. "You're just being polite." "I'm a rancher, Mrs. Ellison. I don't have time to be polite." He took another bite, gestured at the chicken with his free hand. "Cut into that. I want to know if it's as good as it smells." They ate together on that bench, the December cold settling around them, the church steeple casting a long shadow over the frosted grass. And for the first time in 2 years, Mara Ellison didn't feel like a ghost haunting her own life. She felt for one strange and fragile afternoon like a woman someone had actually seen. "Can I ask you something?" Grant said, after a while, when the chicken was half gone and the worst of the awkwardness between two near strangers had melted into something easier. "You can ask." "Why do you keep coming back? To the auction, I mean. Higgins told me—" "Well, he didn't tell me. I overheard some of the folks in line. This isn't the first year this has happened to you." Mara was quiet for a moment, looking out at the frost-covered grass, the bare branches of the oak tree near the church fence. "Because if I stop," she said slowly, "if I stop showing up, stop trying, stop putting myself out there even when it hurts, then they win. Then I become exactly what they've decided I am, a woman who disappeared, a ghost." She shook her head. "My husband used to tell me I was never meant to be small. I think about that a lot now that he's gone, and I figure the least I can do to honor that is to keep being here, even when here doesn't want me." Grant was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Something between admiration and something raw, something that looked almost like recognition, like he understood exactly what that kind of stubborn, lonely persistence cost a person. "I lost my wife 4 years ago," he said finally. "Fever took her in a week. We never had children. Tried for years. Never happened. So when she died, it was just me and about 1,000 acres of land and cattle that don't care if you're grieving. They still need feeding." He turned the half-eaten biscuit over in his hands. "I understand something about being a ghost in your own life." Mara looked at him properly then, this stranger who'd ridden into a town hall and upended 2 years of careful, practiced humiliation with $50 and a steady voice, and she thought, "Oh, there you are, another person who understands." "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "For your wife. I'm sorry for your husband." He met her eyes. "Seems like we've got more in common than a storm and a head injury." She almost laughed again. "Seems like it." They sat together a while longer, the cold deepening as the afternoon wore on, the pie disappearing slice by slice between them, the conversation drifting easily from grief into smaller things. Her years of cooking for church suppers before everything changed, his struggles getting the ranch through last winter's drought, the particular loneliness of a house built for 2 people now occupied by 1. When the light began to fail and the cold grew sharp enough to ache in her fingers, Grant finally stood, brushing crumbs from his coat, and held out a hand to help her up. "I'd like to do this again," he said. "If you'll let me." Mara looked at him, at the steady dark eyes, the scar near his temple that she'd put there in a roundabout way 3 years ago without ever knowing it, the quiet, unhurried sincerity that seemed to radiate off him like heat from a stove, and felt something in her chest crack open, just slightly, just enough to let a little light through after 2 years of darkness. "I'd like that too," she said. "Saturday," he said. "I'll come by your place if that's all right. Bring something this time instead of just eating yours." "You don't have to do that." "I want to." He settled his hat back on his head, and for a moment in the fading light, he looked almost shy, almost uncertain in a way that didn't match the confident man who'd shocked an entire town hall into silence that morning. "Truth is, Mrs. Ellison, I haven't had a conversation like this in longer than I care to admit. Wouldn't mind having another." "Mara," she said, "please. Call me Mara." Mara. He said her name like he was testing the weight of it, like it mattered to him to get it right. "Grant, since we're doing away with formalities." "Grant," she repeated, and the name felt strange and warm in her mouth, the first new thing she'd let herself want in 2 years. He walked her partway home, the two of them moving slowly through the lengthening shadows of Cedar Hollow's main street, past the dry goods store where Mrs. Calloway watched them through the window with undisguised curiosity, past the saloon where a few men had already gathered to gossip about the day's events, past Florence Whitaker's house, where a curtain twitched suspiciously as they passed. Mara noticed all of it, and for the first time in 2 years, none of it mattered. When they reached the turn toward her small house at the edge of town, Grant stopped, turned to face her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the cold air between them charged with something neither was quite ready to name. "Saturday," he said again. "Saturday," she agreed. He tipped his hat to her, the old-fashioned gesture somehow exactly right for a man like him, and turned to walk back toward wherever he'd left his horse. Mara stood and watched him go, his tall figure growing smaller against the darkening street, and she pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart beating hard and fast and alive for the first time since Daniel's funeral. She thought about the morning, the nickel bid, the laughter, the careful, practiced way she'd held her chin up and refused to let them see her break. She thought about the way the whole room had gone silent when Grant Mercer's voice cut through it, $50 landing like a thunderclap in a hall full of people who'd spent 2 years convincing her she was worth nothing at all. She didn't know, walking home alone in the gathering dark, that this single afternoon, what one bold bid, one stranger's debt finally repaid, was about to unravel everything Cedar Hollow thought it understood about who deserved love, who deserved respect, and who got to decide the difference. She only knew that for the first time in 2 years, walking through the cold toward an empty house, she didn't feel quite so alone. And somewhere behind her, in town, the whispers had already begun. Saturday came colder than the week before, with a wind that rattled the loose shutter on Mara's kitchen window and carried the smell of wood smoke from every chimney in Cedar Hollow. She'd been up since before dawn again, not out of habit this time, but out of something closer to nerves, scrubbing the kitchen floor on her hands and knees even though it hadn't needed it, straightening the same 3 chairs at her table over and over, like rearranging them might somehow rearrange her life too. She caught herself in the small mirror by the door around noon and stood there a long moment, studying her own face. She'd put on her blue dress, the one she hadn't worn since before Daniel died, and pinned her hair back the way she used to. She looked, she thought, like a woman waiting for something. She wasn't sure if that made her foolish or just finally awake. Gran arrived a little past 1, riding up on a tall bay horse with saddlebags loaded down, and Mara watched him from the window as he dismounted, tied the horse to her fence post, and stood for a second looking at her little house like he was working up the nerve to knock. It made her smile, somehow, that a man who'd silenced an entire town hall with $50 and a steady voice could look uncertain standing at her gate. She opened the door before he had the chance to knock. "You're early," she said. "I'm on time," he said. "You're just used to people who don't show up." It landed harder than he probably meant it to, and she saw it cross his face a half-second after he'd said it. The realization that he'd cut a little too close to something true. "Sorry," he added. "That wasn't... It's all right." Mara stepped back to let him in. "It's true, so there's no use apologizing for it." He carried the saddlebags in and set them on her kitchen table, and she saw flour, a sack of sugar, a tin of cinnamon, 2 jars of something dark red that turned out to be preserves. "I told you I'd bring something," he said. "And then I realized I don't actually know how to cook anything beyond beans and bacon over a campfire. So I brought the ingredients and was hoping you'd do the honest work while I stood around looking useful." Mara laughed, really laughed, the sound surprising her again the way it had on the bench outside the church, and shook her head. "That's not bringing something, that's bringing me more work. I can hold things, stir things. I'm told I'm a fast learner. We'll see about that." They spent the afternoon in her kitchen, flour dusting the air, Grant rolling up his sleeves and making a genuine, clumsy effort at kneading dough while Mara corrected his grip, laughing at the seriousness with which he approached something as simple as bread. He was, it turned out, exactly the kind of man who took instruction badly at first and then overcorrected, pressing too hard, frowning at the dough like it had personally wronged him. "You're murdering it," Mara said, reaching over to still his hands. "It's bread, Grant, not a fence post. Gentle." "I don't do gentle," he said, but he slowed down anyway, and something about the way his big, sun-browned hands moved more carefully under her guidance made her chest go warm in a way she hadn't expected and wasn't sure what to do with. "Everybody does gentle," she said quietly. "Even you. You just don't get much practice at it out on a ranch full of cattle and hired hands." He glanced sideways at her, something thoughtful passing behind his eyes. "Maybe that's true." They didn't talk about the auction, not at first. They talked about smaller things, his herd, the drought that had nearly broken him the year before, the hired man named Cole, who'd been with him since before his wife died and who Grant said was more trustworthy than most of the town council combined. Mara talked about Daniel, carefully at first and then more easily, telling Grant about the small things she missed most. Not the big sweeping romantic moments people always assumed widows grieved over, but the ordinary ones. The sound of his boots on the porch steps, the way he hummed off key while he worked, The particular silence of a house with two people breathing in it instead of one. I think that's the part nobody warns you about, Grant said, watching her shape the dough into loaves. Everybody talks about missing the big things. Nobody tells you it's the quiet, ordinary stuff that'll gut you on a random Tuesday. Exactly, Mara said, surprised, again, at how easily understood she felt. Exactly that. The bread went into the oven, and while it baked, they sat at her table with 2 cups of coffee, the wind picking up outside, rattling that same loose shutter, and Mara found herself telling him things she hadn't said out loud to another living soul. About the months after Daniel's death when she'd stopped answering her door. About the church ladies who'd brought casseroles for the first 2 weeks, and then simply stopped coming. About the particular cruelty of grief in a small town, where everyone knew your business, and yet somehow nobody actually wanted to sit with you in it. They were kind at first, she said. Florence Whitaker brought a ham. Ruth Pemberton sat with me the first week, helped me with the funeral arrangements. She turned her coffee cup slowly between her hands. But grief that doesn't end on schedule makes people uncomfortable. I think they wanted me to cry for a month and then get back to baking pies for the church socials like nothing happened. When I kept being sad in ways that didn't fit neatly into their idea of how long sad was supposed to last, they decided there was something wrong with me instead of something wrong with what happened to me. Grant was quiet for a long moment. That's a particular kind of lonely. Grieving in front of people who've already decided you should be done grieving. Yes, Mara said softly. That's exactly it. The bread came out golden and good, and Grant declared it the finest thing he'd eaten in months, though Mara suspected by now that he said that about everything she made, and found she didn't mind the exaggeration one bit. They ate at her small table as the afternoon light slanted gold through the window, and when he finally rose to leave as the sun started dipping toward the ridgeline, he lingered at the door a moment longer than necessary. I'd like to come again, he said, next Saturday. If that's not too forward. It's forward, Mara said. But I'd like that too. He smiled, that same boyish, unguarded smile that didn't match the serious rancher who'd stunned a town hall, and tipped his hat before mounting his horse and riding off into the gathering dusk. Mara stood at her door and watched him go, and for the first time in 2 years, the house behind her didn't feel quite so much like a tomb. It became a pattern after that. Every Saturday, sometimes a Wednesday too if the weather held and the ranch work allowed it, Grant Mercer rode the 6 miles from Hollis Ridge into Cedar Hollow and showed up at Mara's door with some excuse or another. Sugar he claimed to be out of, a recipe he wanted her opinion on, a pie tin he needed to return even though he'd never borrowed one in the first place. Mara stopped pretending she didn't see through the excuses, and Grant stopped pretending he needed them. She taught him to bake. Properly, this time. Not just bread, but pies, the lattice crust she was known for. The particular trick of keeping the butter cold so the pastry came out flaky instead of tough. He was a terrible student in the beginning, too impatient, too heavy-handed, the kind of man more comfortable wrestling 1,000 pounds of frightened cattle than handling delicate pastry dough. But he kept coming back, kept trying, and slowly, over the weeks, his pies started coming out of her little oven actually edible, and then actually good. "You've got the patience of a barn cat," she told him one Saturday in late January, watching him carefully, too carefully, his tongue between his teeth in concentration, crimp the edge of a pie crust. "I'm patient with things that matter," he said, not looking up. "And pie crust matters?" He glanced up at her then, something steady and warm in his dark eyes. "Right now it does." Mara felt her face go hot and busied herself with the stove so he wouldn't see it. They talked on those Saturdays about everything and nothing. He told her about losing his wife, Caroline, 4 years back. The fever that took her in a week, the particular hollow quiet of a ranch house built for a family that never came. He told her about the ranch itself, the long, hard years of building it up from almost nothing, the way his father had warned him cattle ranching out past Hollis Ridge would break him before it made him rich, and how he'd spent a decade proving his father both right and wrong at the same time. Mara told him about her own life before Daniel, growing up the daughter of a school teacher in a town 2 counties over, about meeting Daniel at a barn dance when she was 19 and falling for him so hard and so fast it had embarrassed her at the time. She told him about the years they'd had together, good years mostly, ordinary in the way good marriages often were. full of small disagreements and smaller reconciliations, full of Sunday dinners and quiet evenings, and the particular comfortable silence of two people who knew each other completely. "I used to think that kind of love only came around once," she admitted one evening, the two of them sitting on her porch steps as the late January cold bit at their cheeks, a blanket Grant had brought from his saddlebag wrapped around both their shoulders. "I used to think, when Daniel died, that whatever I was capable of feeling for another person, I'd already used it up, spent it all on him. Nothing left." "And now?" Grant asked quietly. Mara was quiet for a long moment, watching her breath fog in the cold air. "Now, I'm not so sure that's true." Grant didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. He simply reached over, under the shared blanket, and found her hand and held it, and the two of them sat there in the cold January dark, not speaking, while something unspoken and enormous settled quietly into place between them. The town noticed, of course. The town always noticed. It started small, the way these things always do. A comment here, a raised eyebrow there. Mrs. Calloway at the dry goods store began watching Mara with open curiosity whenever she came in for flour or sugar, her questions a little too pointed, a little too eager. "And how is Mr. Mercer these days? I hear his ranch is doing well. Must be nice, having a man of his means take such an interest in you." Mara learned to deflect, to smile thinly and change the subject, but the questions kept coming, sharper each time, and underneath the curiosity she could feel something else building, something less like interest and more like resentment. By February, the whispers had turned into something closer to gossip, spreading through Cedar Hollow with the particular speed small towns reserved for anything involving scandal, money, or both. "You hear Mercer's been riding into town near every week now." She overheard one afternoon outside the church, two women she didn't recognize speaking just loud enough to be sure she would hear. "Going to see the Ellison widow, practically courting her." "Courting?" the other woman said, her voice dripping with disbelief. "What's there to court? She's nothing. No family money, no land, nothing to offer a man like that except a hot meal and a sad story. I heard he gave $50 for her basket at the auction. 50. My Thomas didn't pay that much for our whole wedding. Strange, isn't it? Man like Mercer could have his pick of any unmarried woman in 3 counties, and he's out here mooning over a widow who can't even keep her own husband's memory respectable. People say she barely grieved the man before she was already chasing after someone new." Mara stood frozen on the church steps, every word landing like a slap, and it took everything in her not to turn around and confront them both. Instead, she walked away quickly, her hands shaking, her face burning with a humiliation she thought she'd already built calluses against. She didn't tell Grant about it. Not at first. She told herself it didn't matter, that gossip was just gossip, that she'd survived 2 years of it already and could survive a little more. But it sat in her chest like a stone, heavier each week, as the whispers grew louder and the looks grew sharper, and the careful, fragile happiness she'd started to build with Grant began to feel less like a gift and more like a target painted on her back. It was Florence Whitaker who finally said something to her directly, cornering Mara outside the dry goods store on a gray, drizzling afternoon in early February. "Mara." Florence's voice had its usual sharp edge, but there was something almost gentle underneath it this time, which somehow made it worse. "Might I have a word?" "Of course, Florence." Florence glanced around as though checking who might overhear, and then lowered her voice. "I think it's only right someone tells you plainly what's being said, as a kindness, you understand. Better you hear it from me than have it whispered behind your back forever." "I'd imagine I've already heard most of it," Mara said evenly. "Then you know how this looks." Florence's eyes were unreadable. A man like Grant Mercer, one of the most respected ranchers in the county, spending all his free time on a widow with no family, no prospects, nothing to bring to a match, except a kitchen and a sad story. People are saying you've set your sights on his money, that you've used your circumstances to draw sympathy out of a lonely man and worm your way into his life. Mara felt the words land like stones, one after another, and forced herself to keep her voice steady. "Is that what you think, Florence? That I'm after his money?" Florence's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment something almost like discomfort flickered across her face. I think it doesn't matter much what I believe. It matters what the town believes. And the town has decided you're trouble, Mara. You've been trouble since Daniel died, if I'm honest, the way you never could just fade quietly. Grieve properly and step back. Instead, you kept showing up everywhere year after year, like you had some claim on belonging here that the rest of us were obligated to honor. I do have a claim, Mara said, and her voice cracked slightly despite her best efforts to keep it even. I lived here. I buried my husband here. This is my home. Was, Florence said quietly. It was your home when Daniel was alive to anchor you to it. Without him, Mara, you're just... She stopped herself, but the unfinished sentence hung in the cold drizzle between them anyway, and Mara understood exactly what she'd been about to say. You're just a woman alone, and this town has no place for that. I think you should consider, Florence continued, recovering her composure, whether continuing this arrangement with Mr. Mercer is wise, for your sake as much as his. People are talking, Mara, and people in this town have long memories and longer tongues. It would be a shame for things to escalate beyond simple talk. Is that a threat? Mara asked quietly. It's a warning, Florence said. From someone who, despite everything, doesn't actually wish to see you hurt. She paused, though I suspect you won't believe that. She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked off through the drizzle, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, leaving Mara standing alone outside the dry goods store with the cold rain soaking slowly through her coat and Florence's words sitting like ice water in her chest. She told Grant that evening. He'd ridden in unannounced, something he rarely did, claiming he'd had business in town and thought he'd stop by, though Mara suspected the truth was simpler, that he'd missed her, plain and ordinary, and hadn't wanted to wait until Saturday to say so. She found herself crying before she even meant to, the words coming out tangled and unsteady as she told him about Florence, about the whispers outside the church, about you're after his money and you're just a woman alone, and the particular exhausting weight of being 2 years deep into a town's collective decision that she didn't deserve happiness. Grant listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening progressively as she spoke, his hands curling into loose fists on the kitchen table. They're wrong, he said when she finally finished, about all of it. I know that, Mara said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, frustrated with herself for crying at all. Knowing it doesn't make it hurt less. No, Grant agreed quietly. I imagine it doesn't. He was silent for a long moment, staring at the table, and when he looked up again, there was something hard and resolute in his expression that Mara hadn't seen before. I should have thought about this, he said, about what coming around so often would do to your reputation. I was selfish, I wanted to see you, and I didn't think enough about what it would cost you to be seen with me. Don't, Mara said sharply. Don't you dare apologize for wanting to spend time with me, Grant Mercer. I won't have it. I've had 2 years of this town deciding what I deserve and what I don't, and I will not let you join them, even if your version of it comes wrapped up as an apology. Something shifted in his face. Surprise, maybe? Or something closer to admiration. All right, he said slowly. Then I won't apologize. But I will say this. He reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing slow, steady circles over her knuckles. I'm not going anywhere, Mara. Whatever this town decides to say about us, whatever Florence Whitaker thinks she knows about my intentions or your character, none of it changes a single thing about how I feel. And how do you feel? Mara asked quietly, her heart hammering. Grant met her eyes, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, the kitchen quiet except for the wind outside and the soft crackle of the fire in the stove. I feel, he said slowly, like he was choosing each word with great care, like a man who spent 4 years convinced he'd already had the only good thing he was ever going to get. And then a woman pulled me half dead off the side of a road in a storm, and 3 years later I sat in a town hall and watched the same woman get laughed at by people who didn't deserve to be in the same room as her, and something in me decided I wasn't going to let that stand. He paused. I feel like I'm falling for you, Mara Ellison. Plainly, and without much grace about it, and probably faster than is sensible for 2 grieving widowed people who've known each other less than 2 months. But there it is. Mara's breath caught in her throat. Grant, you don't have to say anything, he said quickly. I just figured you ought to know, plainly, what you're dealing with, whatever the town decides to make of it. I wasn't going to tell you to stop, Mara said softly. I was going to say I think I'm falling for you too, faster than is sensible. Same as you. As something in Grant's face broke open then, relief and tenderness all at once, and he stood, crossed around the table, and pulled her up out of her chair and into his arms. And Mara let herself be held, properly held, for the first time in 2 years, his chin resting against the top of her head, his heartbeat steady and sure beneath her ear. "Let them talk," he murmured into her hair. "Let the whole town talk themselves hoarse. I don't care what they say about either of us so long as you're standing here." Mara closed her eyes and let herself believe, just for that one quiet evening, that it might actually be that simple. It would not be that simple. But she didn't know that yet, and for one night, standing in his arms in her small kitchen with the fire crackling and the wind howling outside, she let herself have this, unguarded, uncomplicated, entirely hers. But Cedar Hollow did not let things go quietly. It never had. By the first week of March, the whispers had calcified into something far more organized, far more dangerous than gossip outside the dry goods store. The town council, 5 men, led by a heavy-set cattle buyer named Walter Driscoll, who'd had his own designs on a merger between his daughter and Grant Mercer's ranch for the better part of 2 years, began meeting with unusual frequency at the saloon, their conversations hushed, but their glances toward Mara whenever she passed. Anything but subtle. She felt it everywhere now. The way conversation stopped when she entered the dry goods store. The way Mrs. Calloway's friendliness had curdled into something cold and calculating. The way children she'd once taught Sunday school lessons to now crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her coming, clearly coached by parents who'd decided she was something to be avoided rather than greeted. It came to a head on a cold, overcast Sunday in mid-March, after church, when Walter Driscoll approached her directly for the first time, his expression carrying the particular smugness of a man who believed himself to be acting in everyone's best interest. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, blocking her path on the church steps with his considerable bulk. "A word, if I might." "Mr. Driscoll." Mara kept her voice even, though her stomach had already started to twist. "I'll be direct with you, as I find directness saves everyone a great deal of trouble in the long run." Driscoll clasped his hands behind his back, rocking slightly on his heels. "The town council has had some discussions regarding your situation with Mr. Mercer, discussions which, I'm afraid, have not been favorable." "My situation," Mara repeated flatly. "Your relationship," Driscoll clarified, as though the distinction mattered. "It has become, shall we say, a topic of considerable concern among the town's leading families. Mr. Mercer is an important man in this county, Mrs. Ellison. His ranch, his reputation, his standing, these things matter not just to him, but to the economic health of Cedar Hollow as a whole. We cannot simply stand by and watch his judgment be compromised." "Compromised by what exactly?" Mara's voice had gone sharp now, despite her best efforts to remain calm. "By a friendship? By a man choosing to spend time with a woman he respects? By a widow with nothing to offer him beyond sympathy and a hot meal, latching on to the first wealthy man fool enough to take pity on her," Driscoll said, and the cruelty of it, delivered so plainly, so matter-of-factly, took Mara's breath away. "Forgive my bluntness, Mrs. Ellison, but the council feels it would be in everyone's best interest, yours included, if you were to step back from this entanglement. Perhaps consider relocating. There's opportunity in other counties for a woman in your position to start fresh, away from a town that, frankly, has grown weary of the disruption." Mara stared at him, and for a long moment she couldn't find words at all, the sheer audacity of what he was suggesting robbing her of speech entirely. "You're asking me to leave," she finally managed. "You're asking me to leave my home because Grant Mercer cares about me." "I'm suggesting it would be wise," Driscoll said, his tone maddeningly reasonable, as though he were discussing crop rotation rather than dismantling a woman's entire life. "The council has discussed it at some length, and we are prepared to assist with relocation costs, should you choose to be sensible about this." "And if I refuse?" Mara's voice shook now, though whether from fear or fury she couldn't entirely tell. Driscoll's expression hardened slightly. "Then I'm afraid the town may find itself with little choice but to take a firmer stance. There are ways, Mrs. Ellison, to make a person's continued presence in a community considerably more difficult. I would hate to see it come to that. For your sake." He tipped his hat to her then, with the same false courtesy Florence Whitaker had shown weeks earlier, and walked off down the church steps to rejoin his wife, leaving Mara standing frozen in the cold March air, her whole body trembling with a rage so complete it left no room for the tears she might otherwise have shed. She didn't tell Grant right away. She told herself it was because she didn't want to burden him, didn't want to make him responsible for fixing something the town had broken in her long before he'd ever ridden into her life. The truth, though, sitting heavier in her chest, was simpler and uglier. She was afraid that if Grant understood the full weight of what loving her would cost him, his standing, his business relationships, his place in a community he'd spent a decade building himself into, he might decide, however reluctantly, that it wasn't worth it. She carried Driscoll's words alone for nearly a week, moving through her days with a hollow, brittle kind of calm, until Grant arrived unannounced on a Wednesday evening and found her sitting at her kitchen table in the dark, having not bothered to light a single lamp. Mara. He was beside her in an instant, crouching down, his hands finding hers in the dim light. What happened? Talk to me. And so finally, she told him. All of it. Driscoll's visit, the council's discussions, the offer of relocation money dressed up as kindness, the thinly veiled threat underneath it. She watched his face change as she spoke, the easy warmth she'd come to know draining away, replaced by something colder, harder, something she'd never seen in him before. They want to run you out of town, he said slowly, when she finished, his voice deceptively quiet. Because of me. It's not just because of you, Mara said. It's 2 years of building, Grant. You're just the reason they finally found an excuse to act on it. That doesn't make it better. He stood, paced once across her small kitchen, his hands raking through his hair. I should have known. I should have seen this coming the moment I bid on that basket. I knew how this town treated you, and I walked right into it without thinking through what it would cost you. Stop, Mara said sharply, standing as well. Stop taking responsibility for other people's cruelty. You didn't do this, Grant. Walter Driscoll did this. Florence Whitaker did this. This town, with its long memory and its short patience for anyone who doesn't fit neatly into the shape they've decided is acceptable, they did this. Not you. Grant turned to face her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The only sound the wind rattling that same loose shutter, a sound Mara had come to associate, strangely, with every significant conversation of the past 2 months. I won't let them push you out, he said finally, his voice low and absolutely certain. I don't care what it costs me. I'm not going to stand by and watch this town do to you what it's already done for 2 years, simply because being seen with me has given them a fresh excuse. Grant, your business, you're standing in this county. If you fight them on this, you could lose everything you've built. Then I'll lose it. He crossed the room and took her face gently in both hands, his dark eyes fierce and unwavering in the dim light. Mara, listen to me. I built that ranch up from nothing because I had something to prove to a father who didn't believe in me. I don't need this town's approval to keep it standing, but I do need you to understand that I am not the kind of man who walks away from someone simply because protecting them gets expensive. Mara felt tears finally breaking free, sliding hot down her cheeks, and Grant wiped them away with his thumbs, his touch infinitely gentle despite the hard set of his jaw. What are you going to do? She whispered. I don't know yet, he admitted, but I promise you this. Whatever Walter Driscoll and his council have planned, they have severely underestimated what they're about to be dealing with. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutter harder, and somewhere across town, in the warm glow of the saloon, Walter Driscoll and the council were already deep in their final discussions. Discussions that would, within the week, set in motion a confrontation that would tear Cedar Hollow's careful, cruel order wide open, and force every single person in that town to finally show their true face. Mara didn't know any of that yet, standing in her dark kitchen in Grant Mercer's hands. She only knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. And that for a woman who'd spent 2 years convinced she'd never matter to anyone again, that single fact had changed absolutely everything. The council's letter came on a Friday morning, delivered by a boy of maybe 12 who knocked on Mara's door, shoved an envelope into her hands, and ran off before she could even thank him, like he'd been told not to linger. She stood on her porch and read it twice before the words actually settled into meaning. Mrs. Ellison, it is the decision of the Cedar Hollow Town Council, following careful deliberation, that your continued residence within town limits presents an ongoing disruption to community harmony. You are hereby requested to vacate your property by the 1st of April. The council has authorized a sum of $75 to assist with relocation expenses. Failure to comply will result in further measures as the council deems necessary. Driscoll, on behalf of the Cedar Hollow Town Council. Mara read it a third time, sitting down hard on her porch steps, the cold morning air doing nothing to cool the heat rising in her chest. $75. They'd priced her out of 2 years of her life, out of the house she'd shared with Daniel, out of the only home she had left, for $75 and a letter delivered by a child too young to understand what he was carrying. She didn't cry. She was somewhat surprised by that herself, sitting there in the cold with the letter trembling in her hands. She'd expected tears. Instead, what came was something colder, harder, a kind of clarity she hadn't felt in 2 years. They think I'll just go. She thought about Daniel, about the porch railing he'd built with his own hands the summer before he died, about the garden out back that she'd planted and replanted every spring since, stubborn rows of vegetables that came up every year regardless of how little she felt like tending them. She thought about every humiliation she'd swallowed in this town, every nickel bid, every averted glance, every casserole that stopped coming. And she thought, with a kind of fierce and sudden resolve, no, I built something here too, even if nobody wants to admit it. She folded the letter carefully and walked into town. She found Grant at the feed store, loading sacks of grain onto his wagon, his sleeves rolled up despite the cold, sweat on his brow from the work. He looked up when she approached and immediately set down the sack in his arms, his expression sharpening at whatever he saw on her face. "Mara, what's wrong?" She handed him the letter without a word. He read it once, his jaw tightening with each line, and by the time he reached the bottom, his hands were gripping the paper hard enough to crease it badly. $75, he said, his voice low and dangerous. They priced you at $75. It's not really about the money, Mara said, though her voice shook slightly. It's about making it official, making it legal sounding, like they have the right to just decide I don't belong here anymore. Grant folded the letter with deliberate care, tucked it into his coat pocket, and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something beyond anger, something closer to cold, focused resolve. They don't have that right, he said. Whatever Driscoll thinks he's authorized to do, a town council doesn't have legal standing to force a citizen off her own property. This is intimidation, Mara, not law. Try telling that to the rest of the town, Mara said bitterly. They'll back him. Florence Whitaker will back him. Half this town's been waiting 2 years for an excuse to do exactly this. Then we give them a different kind of excuse to remember, Grant said. She looked at him, something in his tone making her pulse quicken. What do you mean? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he finished loading the grain in silence, his movements sharp and efficient, the muscles in his forearms standing out with each lift. And when he was done, he turned to her, wiping his hands on a rag. His expression settled into something resolute. I'm done letting this town dictate the terms of our lives, he said. I've spent the last month trying to figure out the careful way to handle this, the diplomatic way. Talk to Driscoll, talk to the council, try to smooth things over without anyone losing face. He shook his head. I'm done with careful. Careful got you a letter telling you to leave your own home for $75. So what's the alternative, Shitul? Mara asked. Grant, I appreciate you wanting to fight for me. I do. But you can't bully a whole town council into backing down. They have the saloon, the church, half the families in this county on their side. You have a ranch and a reputation that's already taking damage just from being seen with me. Let it take damage, Grant said. I told you before, Mara. I'm not the kind of man who walks away because protecting someone gets expensive. This isn't about money anymore, Mara said. This is them organizing against me, officially, with letters and authorized sums and threats of further measures. That's not something you can out-stubborn, Grant. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. and something in his expression softened slightly, the hard resolve giving way to something gentler underneath. "No," he agreed. "Maybe not, but I have an idea about what might actually work." "What kind of idea?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing slow circles over her knuckles the way it had become his habit to do, and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Trust me," he said. "Give me a few days. I have some thinking to do and a few people I need to talk to. But I promise you, Mara, they are not running you out of this town, not while I have a single dollar or a single ounce of standing left to spend on stopping them." The days that followed were the hardest of the entire ordeal, in some ways harder even than the auction itself. Mara moved through Cedar Hollow like a woman walking through enemy territory, every glance from a neighbor freighted with new meaning, every closed door behind her back a fresh reminder of the deadline ticking down toward April 1st. The whispers had become outright hostility now. Someone left a dead crow on her porch one morning, its neck clearly broken by human hands rather than misfortune. No note attached, none needed. Mrs. Calloway refused to sell her flour at the dry goods store, claiming, with transparent dishonesty, that the shop was simply out of stock, even as Mara watched another woman purchase a full sack not 5 minutes later. The children who used to wave at her now threw words instead, "Witch," one boy called after her, no older than 9, clearly repeating something he'd heard at his own dinner table. And Mara walked on without turning around, her spine rigid, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She told Grant about the crow, reluctantly, because she didn't want to add more weight to whatever burden he was already carrying, but he needed to know, she reasoned, because hiding things from each other had never done either of them any good. His face went pale, and then dark with fury when she described it, and for a moment she thought he might ride straight into town and confront every single person responsible. "This has to stop," he said, his voice tight with restrained anger. "This is no longer gossip, Mara. This is harassment. This is someone breaking a bird's neck and leaving it on your porch to frighten you." "I know," Mara said quietly. "I'm not frightened of a dead bird, Grant. I'm frightened of what comes after the dead bird, if nobody stops this." "Nobody's going to need to stop it," Grant said, "because I'm about to give this whole town something far more interesting to talk about than a basket auction." "What?" He came to her 3 days later on a cold, clear evening in late March, with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something between nervousness and absolute certainty, an odd combination that made her stomach flip the moment she opened her door and saw his face. "Grant." She stepped back to let him in, noting the way he wiped his boots more carefully than usual, the way his hands seemed restless at his sides. "What is it? What's happened?" "Nothing's happened," he said. "Yet." He took off his hat, turned it over in his hands, and for a long moment simply looked at her, something raw and unguarded in his expression that made her breath catch. "I've been thinking these past few days about Driscoll, about the council, about this whole town, and the particular cruelty it's decided to direct at you." "And?" "And I keep coming back to the same conclusion," Grant said. "There's only one thing that town respects more than gossip, Mara, and that's permanence. The council can threaten a widow they think has no standing, no family, nothing tying her to this place beyond a house and 2 years of stubbornness. They cannot, and I've checked this. I spent half of yesterday at the county courthouse confirming it. They cannot legally force out a married woman whose husband owns property and standing in this county the way I do." Mara's heart had started pounding hard before he even finished the sentence, understanding dawning slow and disbelieving. "Grant! Let me finish," he said quickly, and then, with a kind of clumsy, endearing urgency that didn't match the careful, composed man who'd silenced a town hall with $50, he got down on one knee, right there in her small kitchen, his hat falling to the floor beside him, his hands reaching for hers. "Mara Ellison," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been nerves, might have been emotion. "I am not a man given to grand romantic gestures. I'm not Daniel. I never knew him, but from everything you've told me, I imagine he had a poetry in him that I simply don't. I'm a rancher. I deal in cattle and weather and hard, unglamorous work. And I'm 38 years old and set in my ways. And I am asking you to marry me, not because it's romantic, or because some part of me thinks it'll solve every problem this town has decided to throw at us. He squeezed her hands. I'm asking because I love you. Because somewhere in these past 2 months of pie crusts and bad bread and porch conversations in the cold, you became the only thing in my life I am not willing to compromise on. And because, frankly, if marrying me keeps that council from running you out of your own home, then I am more than happy to let this town's cruelty be the reason we finally stop wasting time being careful about something I already know I want. Mara stood frozen, tears already sliding down her cheeks, her hands trembling in his. Grant, this is so fast. We've known each other 2 months. People are already saying everything they're going to say, Grant interrupted gently. There is no version of this where Cedar Hollow decides to be kind about it, Mara. Not now. Maybe not ever. So the only question that actually matters is what you want. Not the town, not the council. Not Florence Whitaker or Walter Driscoll or anyone else who's decided they have a stake in how we live our lives. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, slow and steady. Do you love me? Yes, Mara said, the word coming out without hesitation, surprising even herself with its certainty. Yes, Grant, of course I do. Then marry me, he said. Not because of the council, not because of the letter or the deadline or any of it. Marry me because I'm asking you to build a life with me, the same way you once pulled a half-dead stranger out of a storm without knowing if he'd live to thank you for it. Marry me because I think we found something in each other that neither of us expected to find again, and I am not willing to let a town full of frightened, small-minded people talk us out of it. Mara looked down at him, kneeling on her kitchen floor, his hat forgotten beside him, his dark eyes steady and pleading and utterly sincere, and felt something inside her, something that had been clenched tight with grief and fear and 2 years of careful self-protection, finally, completely let go. Yes, she said, and the word came out as half-laugh, half-sob. Yes, Grant, I'll marry you. He was on his feet in an instant, pulling her into his arms, lifting her clean off the floor, and Mara laughed and cried at the same time, her arms wrapped tight around his neck, the small kitchen suddenly feeling enormous with possibility, with a future she had genuinely believed 2 months earlier she would never get to have again. When? She asked, when he finally set her back down, both of them slightly breathless. Saturday, Grant said. 3 days from now. I already spoke with Reverend Whitfield this afternoon. He's agreed to perform the ceremony, quietly, at the church. No announcements beforehand. I want this done, Mara. I want it legal and binding before the 1st of April, before Driscoll and his council have a single chance to do anything about it. 3 days, Mara repeated, equal parts terrified and exhilarated. That's not much time. It's enough time, Grant said. It's enough time for the only 2 people whose opinion actually matters to decide they're sure. And we're sure, aren't we? Mara looked at him, at the steady dark eyes, the small scar near his temple that connected them across 3 years and 1 terrible storm, the quiet, unwavering certainty radiating off him despite the chaos building around them both, and felt for the first time in longer than she could remember, completely and entirely sure of something. We're sure, she said. Word got out before the wedding day, of course. Word always got out in Cedar Hollow, no matter how careful anyone tried to be, and by Friday evening, the news that Grant Mercer intended to marry Mara Ellison, quietly, quickly, before the council's deadline, had spread through the town like wildfire through dry grass. Walter Driscoll showed up at Grant's ranch himself that evening, riding hard, his face red with exertion and fury by the time he dismounted in front of the main house. "Mercer," he barked, not bothering with pleasantries. "I hear you've lost your mind." Grant came out onto the porch, unhurried, his expression carefully neutral, despite the tension Mara could see coiled in his shoulders, even from where she stood just inside the doorway, watching. "Evening, Walter," Grant said. "Something I can help you with?" "You can start by explaining to me what in God's name you think you're doing, marrying that woman before the council's even had a chance to finish its business with her." "My business, last I checked, isn't subject to the council's approval," Grant said evenly. "Who I marry and when isn't something you or anyone else gets a vote on." Driscoll's face went a deeper shade of red. "This isn't just about you, Mercer, and you know it. You've got contracts with half the ranchers in this county. You've got dealings with the bank, with the railroad spur the town's been negotiating, with more business interests than I care to list, all of which depend on this community's goodwill. You really willing to throw all of that away for a widow with nothing to her name? Watch how you talk about her, Grant said, his voice gone suddenly hard and cold in a way Mara had never heard from him before. I mean that, Walter. I will not stand here on my own porch and listen to you speak about my future wife like she's a piece of livestock you're appraising. Driscoll seemed to catch himself, recalibrating slightly, though the fury hadn't left his face. I'm only saying what half this county is already thinking, Mercer. You're a smart man, a successful one. You really willing to torch every relationship you've built over a decade, every contract, every ounce of goodwill, for a woman the whole town's already decided isn't worth the trouble? I'm willing to torch every relationship in this county, Grant said, stepping down off the porch now, closing the distance between himself and Driscoll until they stood nearly chest to chest. Before I let this council bully a grieving widow out of her own home with a letter and $75. You want to talk about what I'm willing to throw away, Walter? Fine. Let's talk plainly. I am willing to lose every single contract, every business relationship, every ounce of standing I've built in this county before I let you or Florence Whitaker or anyone else decide that Mara Ellison doesn't deserve a life here. Is that clear enough for you? Driscoll stared at him for a long moment, something calculating shifting behind his eyes. The council won't take this lying down, Mercer. You marry her, you're not just protecting one widow from a relocation request. You're declaring war on the entire town leadership. Then it's war, Grant said simply. I've fought harder battles than this over cattle prices, Walter. I imagine I'll survive a fight over basic decency. Driscoll's jaw worked silently for a moment, and then, without another word, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode off into the gathering dusk, his retreating figure radiating a fury that promised this was far from over. Grant watched him go, his shoulders still tense, and didn't relax until the sound of hoofbeats had faded entirely into the darkness. Then he turned back toward the house, where Mara stood in the doorway, having heard every word. You shouldn't have to choose between your business and me, she said quietly when he reached her. I'm not choosing between them, Grant said, pulling her gently into his arms. I already chose. There was never actually a contest, Mara. There's the life I want, and there's everything else. Driscoll just hasn't figured out yet that everything else doesn't actually weigh anything against you. The wedding, when it came, was nothing like Mara had imagined for herself the second time around. No careful months of planning, no new dress sewn special for the occasion, no family gathered from neighboring counties to celebrate. It was small, quiet, almost furtive, held at dawn on Saturday morning in the little white church with the unpainted steeple, with only Reverend Whitfield, Grant's hired man Cole, serving as witness, and Mrs. Calloway's elderly mother, the one person in town, it turned out, who'd quietly disagreed with the council's treatment of Mara from the start, and who'd insisted on attending despite her daughter's objections. Mara wore her blue dress again, the same one she'd worn the first Saturday Grant came to her kitchen, because there hadn't been time for anything else, and because somehow it felt right. A small, private continuity between the man who'd first knelt at her table with flour on his hands and the man who now stood beside her at the altar, his own hands trembling slightly as he took hers. The ceremony had barely begun, Reverend Whitfield's voice just settling into its rhythm, when the church doors burst open with a crash that echoed through the small sanctuary. Walter Driscoll stood in the doorway, flanked by 3 other council members, Florence Whitaker among them, her face a mask of righteous fury, the morning light behind them throwing their shapes into stark, ominous silhouette. "Stop this ceremony," Driscoll announced, his voice booming through the church. "Right now." Reverend Whitfield froze, his Bible still open in his hands, his eyes wide with alarm. Mara felt Grant's hand tighten around hers, steady despite the chaos suddenly erupting around them. "Walter," Grant said, turning to face the intruders, his voice deceptively calm. "This is a private ceremony. You and your council have no standing here." "We have every standing," Driscoll snapped, striding up the center aisle, the others trailing behind him. "This marriage is an act of open defiance against the council's authority, and I am here to inform you, formally, in front of this congregation." He gestured at the sparse handful of witnesses, the word congregation almost laughable given the small turnout, That proceeding with this union will result in immediate and severe consequences. What consequences? Grant asked, his voice still even, though Mara could feel the tension radiating off him now, coiled and ready. The council will move to terminate every contract your ranch currently holds within county lines, Driscoll said. The railroad spur negotiations, dead. Your grazing agreements with the Hendricks and Caldwell spreads, dead. You're standing with First County Bank, so. And I happen to know the bank president personally, Mercer. Don't think I don't. Will be reviewed, and I promise you, not favorably. You marry this woman today, you will watch everything you've built over the past decade crumble within the year. A murmur ran through the small gathering. Mrs. Calloway's mother gasped softly. Mara felt her stomach drop. The weight of what Grant stood to lose suddenly, devastatingly real in a way it hadn't quite been before. Standing here in the cold morning light of the church, with everything actually on the line. "Grant," she whispered, turning to him. "Maybe we should—" "No," Grant said, not looking away from Driscoll, his voice carrying clearly through the whole sanctuary now. "No, Mara, we're not stopping." He turned then, fully, to face Driscoll and the council members standing behind him, and something in his posture shifted, not aggressive exactly, but utterly immovable, like a man who'd already weighed every possible cost and found none of it heavy enough to change his answer. "You want to talk about consequences, Walter?" Grant said, his voice ringing out through the small church. "Fine. Let's talk plainly, in front of God and everyone else gathered here, about exactly what kind of man this town has been propping up as its moral authority." "Watch yourself, Mercer," Driscoll growled. "No, I don't think I will." Grant's voice had gone hard now, cutting and clear. "You want to terminate my contracts? Go ahead. Pull every grazing agreement, every railroad negotiation, every dollar of business this council can touch. I built this ranch up from nothing once already, Walter. I can do it again if I have to. What I will not do, what I refuse to do, in front of every person standing in this church right now, is stand by and let a council of small, frightened men decide that a woman's worth is measured by how much land she owns or how much money she brings into a marriage." He turned briefly to look at Mara, his expression softening even as his voice remained hard enough to fill the room. "This woman pulled a stranger half dead out of a storm 3 years ago and never once expected thanks for it," he continued, turning back to face Driscoll and the council. "She spent 2 years grieving a husband she loved with her whole heart, in a town that decided her grief made everyone else uncomfortable. So instead of supporting her, you mocked her. You let children throw a nickel at her like she was a circus act. You left her flour off the shelves and dead birds on her porch, and a letter demanding she leave her own home for $75, like her entire life could be settled with a number." His voice rose now, carrying real fury beneath the control. "And you call that community? You call that Christian charity, Walter, when half of you haven't shown an ounce of it to a grieving woman in 2 solid years." Florence Whitaker's face had gone pale, something flickering behind her composed mask. Not quite guilt, but something close to it. "Character," Grant said, his voice finally softening, though it lost none of its conviction, "is not measured by a bank account or a deed to property. It's measured by what a person does when nobody's offering them anything in return. By what they give when giving costs them something. Mara Ellison has shown more character in the 2 months I've known her than this entire council has shown in the 2 years since her husband died. And I would rather lose every contract, every dollar, every ounce of standing I've built in this county, than spend one more day pretending that kind of cruelty deserves my respect." The church had gone utterly silent, the only sound the wind pressing softly against the windows. Every face turned toward Grant, toward Driscoll, toward the moment suspended between them. "Marry her," Driscoll said finally, his voice low and venomous, "and you can consider every relationship this council controls officially severed, Mercer. Don't say you weren't warned." "I was warned," Grant said quietly. "I heard you the first time." He turned back toward Mara, reached for her hand, and looked at her with an expression of such complete, unwavering tenderness that the chaos of the moment seemed to fall away entirely, leaving just the two of them standing at the altar, the rest of the church receding into background noise. "Mara, I asked you a question 3 days ago, and you gave me an answer. I'd like to know if that answer still stands, in light of everything Walter just threatened to take from us."
Bu, you,
Mara looked at him. At this man who just stood in front of the most powerful people in Cedar Hollow and chosen her, plainly and without hesitation, over a decade of carefully built business and standing, and felt something fierce and certain rise up in her chest, burning away whatever fear Driscoll's threats had managed to plant there. "It still stands," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the tears now sliding down her cheeks. "It stands more than it did 3 days ago." Reverend Whitfield, who had stood frozen through the entire confrontation, finally cleared his throat, glancing nervously between Driscoll's furious retreating figure. For the council had indeed begun filing back out of the church, Florence Whitaker the last to go, casting one final, unreadable glance over her shoulder before the door swung shut behind her, and the two people standing at his altar, waiting. "Well," the Reverend said, his voice still slightly unsteady, Shall we continue, then?" "Please," Grant said, turning back to Mara, taking both her hands in his thumbs tracing slow, steady circles over her knuckles the way they always did, grounding her, anchoring her, even now, even here. And so, in a small church with an unpainted steeple, in front of a handful of witnesses and the lingering echo of a town council's fury still hanging in the cold morning air, Reverend Whitfield resumed the ceremony, his voice growing steadier with each line, and Mara Ellison and Grant Mercer became husband and wife. Not because Cedar Hollow had blessed the union, not because the town's leading families had finally found their hearts, but because two people who had each survived their own particular grief had found, against every expectation either of them carried, something worth fighting an entire town for. When Reverend Whitfield finally pronounced them married, his voice ringing out the final words into the quiet sanctuary, Grant pulled Mara into his arms and kissed her, slow and certain, while Cole let out a whoop of pure delight that echoed off the rafters, and Mrs. Calloway's mother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and outside, somewhere across town, Walter Driscoll was already drafting the first of what would prove to be many, many letters terminating Grant Mercer's contracts across Cedar Hollow County. Neither Mara nor Grant knew yet exactly how steep a price that morning's defiance would cost them in the months ahead. They only knew, standing together at the altar with the whole weight of the town's fury bearing down on them, that for the first time since either of them had lost the people they loved, they were no longer facing the world alone. The first letter arrived 4 days after the wedding, delivered to the ranch by a courier from First County Bank, and Grant read it standing at his own kitchen table with the same controlled stillness Mara had come to recognize as the way he held himself together when something hurt worse than he let on. "They're calling the note," he said quietly, setting the letter down, "on the East Pasture loan, demanding full payment within 30 days. Mara felt her stomach drop. "Can they do that? Just call it like that without warning?" "Bank president's first cousin to Driscoll's wife," Grant said, his voice flat. "I should have remembered that before I told Walter to go ahead and pull every string he could reach." He rubbed a hand over his face, and for the first time since Mara had known him, he looked genuinely tired, the weight of the morning's defiance finally settling into his shoulders now that the adrenaline of the church had worn off. 30 days. That's most of what I've got in reserve right there, just to keep the bank off my back." "Grant." Mara crossed the kitchen and put her hand over his on the table. "I told you, this is what I was afraid of. They're not bluffing. They're going to bleed you dry, piece by piece, until what?" Grant looked up at her, and despite the exhaustion in his face, there was something steady underneath it, something that hadn't bent yet. "Until I decide marrying you wasn't worth it? That's not happening, Mara. I told you that in the church, in front of all of them, and I meant every word." "I know you meant it," Mara said. "I'm not doubting that. I'm scared of what it's going to cost you to keep meaning it." Grant turned his hand over beneath hers, lacing their fingers together. "Then we figure it out together. That's what married people do, isn't it? I wouldn't really know firsthand, but I'd imagine that's the whole point." Despite everything, Mara found herself smiling, small and tired, but real. "I'd imagine so too." The weeks that followed tested both of them in ways neither had fully anticipated. The railroad spur negotiations collapsed within 2 weeks. The county commissioners, most of them friendly with Driscoll, all of them eager to avoid controversy, quietly rerouting the proposed line through Hendricks Land instead, costing Grant a deal he'd spent the better part of a year working toward. The grazing agreements followed soon after, neighboring ranchers backing out one by one, some apologetically, murmuring about pressure from the council, others with a coldness that made clear exactly where their loyalties lay. Grant sold off part of his herd to cover the banknote, a decision that visibly cost him something beyond money. Mara watched him stand at the fence the morning the buyer's men came to collect the cattle, his jaw tight, his eyes following each animal as it was loaded, and she understood, without him having to say it, that this was a man watching a piece of 10 years' hard work walk away because of a choice he'd made standing at an altar. "You don't regret it," she said that evening, not quite a question, sitting beside him on the porch steps as the sun went down over the ridge. "No," Grant said, without hesitation. "I don't regret you, Mara. Not for 1 second. I regret that Walter Driscoll gets to feel like he's winning right now. That's a different thing entirely." "He's not winning," Mara said quietly. "Not really. He's just making it expensive. Those aren't the same as winning." Grant looked over at her, something in his tired face softening. "When did you get so wise about all this?" "I had a lot of time to think these past 2 years," Mara said, "about what people can take from you and what they can't. They took my standing in this town. They took the casseroles and the Sunday invitations and most of my friends. But they never managed to take the part of me that knew I deserved better than how they were treating me. That part stayed mine the whole time, even when everything else felt like it was being stripped away." She reached over and took his hand. "They can take your contracts, Grant. They can take your cattle and your bank loans and every business deal in this county. They can't take the part of you that chose to stand up in that church and tell the truth in front of everyone. That's yours. That's ours. They don't get a vote on that." Grant was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade behind the ridge, and then he pulled her against his side, his arm wrapping around her shoulders, and they sat together in the gathering dark, saying nothing else, needing nothing else said. But the council's campaign didn't stop at business. By the start of May, it had turned personal in ways that frightened Mara more than any letter or terminated contract ever could. It started with the hired hands. 2 of Grant's longtime ranch workers, men who'd been with him for years, quit within the same week, both citing vague reasons that didn't quite add up, both avoiding Grant's eyes when they gave their notice. Cole, his foreman, came to Grant privately afterward, his expression grim. "It's not really about the work, boss," Cole admitted. "Tom's wife works at the dry goods store. Said she got told, real plain, that things would go a lot smoother for her family if her husband found work elsewhere. Same kind of thing happened to Pete, near as I can tell, just from a different direction." "They're going after my hired hands now," Grant said, his voice tight with disbelief and fury in equal measure. "Threatening their families to get them to quit." "Looks that way," Cole said. "I ain't going anywhere, for what it's worth, but I figured you ought to know what you're dealing with." It got worse from there. Someone set fire to a section of fence line out past the north pasture one night in mid-May. Nothing catastrophic, easily repaired but unmistakably deliberate. The kind of message that didn't need a signature to be understood. Mara found herself looking over her shoulder more often than she wanted to admit, jumping at unexpected sounds. The easy peace she'd started to build in those first weeks with Grant, curdling slowly into a low, constant hum of dread. "I think about the crow sometimes," she admitted to Grant one night, unable to sleep, staring up at the dark ceiling of the bedroom that was now, officially, hers as much as his. "The one on my porch. I keep wondering how far this town is actually willing to go." Grant rolled onto his side, studying her face in the dim moonlight coming through the window. "I won't lie to you and say I don't wonder the same thing," he said. "But I will say this. Whatever Driscoll and his council are willing to do, they're doing it because they're losing, Mara. People don't escalate when they're winning. They escalate when something's slipping out of their control." "What's slipping out of their control?" Mara asked. "We're the ones losing contracts and hired hands and fence lines." "We're losing money," Grant corrected gently. "That's not the same as losing. What's slipping is the story they've been telling this whole town for 2 years. The one where you're nothing, where you don't matter, where they get to decide your worth, and everybody just nods along. Every time they escalate, Mara, it's because that story is getting harder to hold together. People are starting to ask questions. Reverend Whitfield's been getting an earful from some of the older folks in the congregation who think the council's gone too far. Mrs. Calloway's mother isn't the only one who started speaking up. It doesn't feel like the story's slipping, Mara said quietly. It feels like it's winning. It feels that way because cruelty's loud, Grant said, and decency takes its time finding its voice. But it's coming, Mara. I believe that. I have to believe that, or none of what we did in that church meant a damn thing. The turning point, when it finally came, arrived from a direction neither of them expected. It was early June, the heat starting to build into the long stretch of summer, when Reverend Whitfield himself rode out to the ranch, alone, his expression carrying none of the nervous uncertainty Mara remembered from the wedding morning. He found Grant and Mara in the kitchen, sat heavily at their table when invited, and accepted a cup of coffee with the air of a man who'd come to say something difficult and wanted a moment to gather himself before saying it. "I owe you both an apology," he said finally, turning the coffee cup slowly between his hands. "I stood in my own church and let Walter Driscoll threaten 2 people I'd agreed to marry, and I did nothing but stand there with my mouth open. I've thought about that morning every day since, and I'm ashamed of how little courage I showed when courage was actually required of me." "You finished the ceremony?" Mara said gently. "That took some courage, Reverend, whatever else happened." "It took less courage than it should have," Whitfield said. "I want to make amends for that, properly, this time." He set down his coffee cup. "I've spoken with several families in the congregation this past month, quietly, carefully, the way these things have to be done in a town like this. There's more discomfort with the council's actions than Driscoll seems to realize. The fence fire especially. Folks don't take kindly to that kind of thing, even folks who might have agreed with the relocation letter back in March. There's a difference, in most people's minds, between disapproving of a marriage and burning a man's property over it." "What are you saying, Reverend?" Grant asked. "I'm saying I intend to speak from the pulpit this Sunday," Whitfield said. "Plainly, about character, about cruelty dressed up as community standards, about what it means to call yourself a Christian congregation while terrorizing a grieving widow and her new husband. I should have said it months ago. I'm saying it now." He looked between them both. "I won't pretend that one sermon undoes everything this town has done to you, Mrs. Mercer, but I believe it's a start, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that more of this congregation is ready to hear it than Walter Driscoll would like to think." Mara felt something tight in her chest ease, just slightly, for the first time in weeks. "Thank you, Reverend. That means more than you probably know." The sermon, when it came that Sunday, was not gentle. Mara and Grant sat together near the back of the church. They'd debated whether to even attend, given everything, but Grant had insisted, his jaw set with the same stubborn resolve that had carried him through the wedding confrontation, and Mara had agreed because she was tired, finally, of letting fear decide where she did and didn't show her face in this town. Reverend Whitfield stood at his pulpit and spoke for nearly 20 minutes, his voice carrying clear and unflinching through the packed sanctuary, about the particular sin of mistaking cruelty for righteousness, about congregations that prided themselves on their charity while withholding the most basic decency from their own neighbors, about a community that had spent 2 years deciding a grieving widow's pain was an inconvenience rather than a wound deserving care. He didn't name Driscoll directly. He didn't need to. Every eye in the church found its way, at some point during those 20 minutes, to where Walter Driscoll sat rigid in his usual pew, his face darkening by degrees, Florence Whitaker beside him staring fixedly at her own folded hands. "We have, as a congregation," Whitfield said, his voice softening slightly toward the end, "the chance every single day to choose whether we build people up or tear them down. I confess to you all that I failed that choice on a cold morning back in March, when I let fear of this town's leading families silence me at my own altar. I do not intend to fail it again. I would ask each of you, in the privacy of your own conscience, to consider whether you have been building or tearing down these past 2 years. And I would ask you to consider, with whatever honesty you can manage, whether the woman this town spent 2 years mocking ever actually deserved a single moment of it." The silence that followed was thick enough to feel, and Mara, sitting in the back pew with Grant's hand wrapped tight around hers, felt tears sliding down her face for reasons she couldn't entirely untangle. Grief, relief, vindication, exhaustion, all of it tangled together into something too large for words. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the bright June morning, something shifted that Mara hadn't expected. Mrs. Calloway approached her hesitantly near the church steps, her expression uncertain. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, the name still strange and new in other people's mouths. "I owe you an apology about the flower. I let myself be talked into something I'm not proud of, and I'm sorry for it. It wasn't everything. It wasn't enough, not really, not after months of cruelty that one apology could undo. But it was something, a small crack in the wall the town had built around her, and over the following weeks more cracks began to show. Two of the families who'd pulled their grazing agreements quietly approached Grant about renewing them. A handful of women who'd avoided Mara in the dry goods store began nodding to her again, small, careful gestures of acknowledgement that meant more than Mara would have predicted, given how little she'd thought she still wanted this town's approval. Walter Driscoll, for his part, did not go quietly. If anything, the shifting tide of public sentiment seemed to harden his resolve rather than soften it, and by midsummer he'd escalated to a tactic neither Grant nor Mara had anticipated. A formal complaint filed with the county, alleging irregularities in Grant's water rights along the section of creek that ran through his property, the kind of bureaucratic maneuver designed to drag through the courts for months, draining money and attention regardless of its merit. "He's not going to stop," Mara said one evening, reading through the complaint papers Grant had brought home from the county office, her stomach twisting with a familiar, exhausted dread. "Is he?" Even with the town starting to turn, "he's just going to keep finding new ways." "Maybe," Grant admitted, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd once knelt and asked her to marry him, now covered in legal papers instead of pie crust. "Walter's the kind of man who doesn't know how to lose gracefully. I imagine he'll keep finding angles until he runs out of them entirely." "And if he doesn't run out?" Grant reached across the table and took her hand. "Then we keep fighting, same as we have been. One letter, one complaint, one fence fire at a time, if that's what it takes." He paused. "But I don't think it'll take that much longer, Mara. I had a conversation yesterday with two of the other council members, Hendricks and old Mr. Avery. Neither of them is comfortable anymore with how far Driscoll's taken this. Hendricks specifically mentioned the water rights complaint, said he thought it crossed a line even Driscoll shouldn't have crossed. I think the council's starting to fracture. That fracture became public a month later in late July at a town meeting called ostensibly to discuss the upcoming Harvest Festival, but which quickly devolved under questioning from several increasingly vocal townspeople into an open reckoning over the council's conduct throughout the spring and summer. Mara hadn't planned to attend. She'd avoided most town gatherings since the wedding, exhausted by months of being a topic of conversation rather than a participant in one. But Grant convinced her gently that her presence mattered, that she deserved to watch this unfold rather than hear about it secondhand. "You don't have to say anything," he told her as they walked into the town hall together, the same hall where the auction had taken place all those months earlier. "You don't owe this town a single word, but I think you should be here when they finally have to answer for it." The meeting started ordinarily enough. Discussions of festival logistics, a brief argument about the price of bunting, and then, almost without transition, Hendricks stood up from his seat among the council and cleared his throat. "I think," he said, his voice carrying through the hall, "that before we discuss the festival any further, this council owes some explanations to people in this room, specifically regarding the treatment of Grant Mercer's water rights, his grazing agreements, and—" He glanced briefly, almost apologetically toward where Mara sat beside Grant. "The treatment of his wife going back considerably further than that." Driscoll's face went rigid. "Hendricks, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," Hendricks said, his voice firm despite an obvious discomfort with confrontation. "I've sat on this council for 6 years, Walter, and I've gone along with a great deal in that time because I trusted your judgment. But I will not sit quietly while you use council authority to settle what amounts to a personal grudge against a man for marrying a woman you've decided isn't good enough for this town. The water rights complaint has no merit. I've seen the survey records myself. It was filed to harass, not to address any genuine irregularity." A murmur swept through the hall, the room's attention swinging fully toward Driscoll now, who sat with his jaw clenched, color rising in his face. "And the relocation letter back in March," old Mr. Avery added, rising slowly from his seat as well, his voice quavering slightly with age, but carrying nonetheless. "I want it on record that I never approved that letter being sent in my name. Walter drafted it and circulated it for signature after the fact, told the rest of us it was already agreed upon. I signed it without reading it carefully enough, and I have regretted that more than I can say, watching what's happened since. The hall had gone fully silent now, every face turned toward Driscoll, who sat alone at the council table, his allies on the council suddenly, visibly, no longer standing with him. This is a betrayal, Driscoll sputtered, rising to his feet. After everything I've done for this council, for this town. What you've done, Hendrik said quietly, is spend 6 months trying to destroy a man's livelihood because his wife didn't fit whatever picture you'd decided this town ought to look like. I think it's time this council formally rescinds the relocation request, drops the water rights complaint, and issues an apology, a real one, not the kind tucked into legal language, to Mr. and Mrs. Mercer for the harm this body has caused them. The room erupted into murmured conversation, some supportive, some still uncertain. But the tide, Mara could feel it clearly now, sitting beside Grant with her heart hammering, had genuinely turned. Driscoll looked around the hall, at the faces no longer entirely on his side, and something in his bearing seemed to deflate, the bluster going out of him all at once. "Fine," he said finally, his voice tight and bitter. "Fine. Rescind it. Drop the complaint. I won't fight the council on it." He looked briefly toward Mara, something unreadable in his expression. Not quite an apology, but not quite the open contempt she'd grown used to from him either. "I still don't think it was wise, either of you marrying so quickly, all of it, but I'll concede the methods went further than they should have." It wasn't an apology, not really, but Mara found, sitting there in that hall where she'd once been laughed at for a nickel bid, that she didn't actually need one from Walter Driscoll. What she'd needed for 2 long years, was simply for this to be over, for the campaign of cruelty and intimidation to finally exhaust itself, and watching the council vote, formally, to rescind the relocation order and drop the water rights complaint. She felt something in her chest finally, fully unclench for the first time since that cold December morning when a $50 bid had changed the entire shape of her life. Grant's hand found hers as the meeting dissolved into smaller conversations around the hall, people approaching them both now with a mixture of relief and lingering awkwardness. The slow, uneven work of a town beginning to mend something it had spent months tearing apart. "It's not perfect," Grant said quietly, leaning close as they finally made their way toward the door. "Some of this town's never going to fully come around. Driscoll certainly isn't going to wake up tomorrow and decide he likes us." "It doesn't need to be perfect," Mara said, surprising herself with how steady her voice came out. "It just needed to stop, and it has." Outside, the summer evening had settled warm and gold over Cedar Hollow's main street, the same street she'd walked alone so many times these past months, head held high through whispers and averted glances, refusing to disappear no matter how hard this town tried to make her. She stood now beside her husband, watching the last of the meeting's attendees filter out into the dusk, some offering tentative nods in her direction, small gestures of an acknowledgement that had taken an entire town nearly destroying itself to finally extend. "Come on," Grant said, squeezing her hand. "Let's go home." Home. The word landed differently now than it had in March, when Driscoll's letter had threatened to take it from her entirely. Mara looked up at her husband, at the ranch waiting for them 6 miles past Hollis Ridge, at the life they'd built together against every obstacle this town had thrown in their path, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely, fully certain of exactly where she belonged. They walked home together in the fading summer light, and behind them, Cedar Hollow settled slowly into a quieter, gentler version of itself. Not perfect, not entirely healed, but no longer, finally, a town actively trying to erase the woman who had simply refused to disappear. Autumn came and went, the ranch settling into the rhythm of harvest and herding, the kind of ordinary, unremarkable work that Mara had come to treasure precisely because of how unremarkable it was. There was a particular kind of peace in mundane things she'd learned, in mending fences and canning preserves and falling asleep each night beside a man who reached for her hand even in his sleep, like some part of him needed to confirm she was still there. After 2 years of being treated like a ghost, she found she had an almost bottomless appetite for ordinary life. She found out she was pregnant in late September, on a morning that started like any other, with a wave of nausea that sent her stumbling out to the porch rail before she'd even finished her coffee. Grant found her there minutes later, alarmed, and when she finally managed to explain, through a mixture of laughter and tears, what she suspected the sickness actually meant, he went very still for a long moment, his weathered face working through something too large for words. "You're sure?" he asked finally, his voice rough. "I'm not sure of anything yet," Mara admitted. "But Grant, I think we should ride into town and see the doctor." He didn't say another word. He simply pulled her into his arms, careful and gentle, in a way that made her laugh through her tears, like she might break if he held her any tighter, and pressed his face into her hair, and Mara felt him shaking slightly, this big, steady man who'd faced down a town council without flinching, undone entirely by the possibility of a child. Dr. Reyes confirmed it 3 days later. Mara was, by his estimation, about 2 months along, due sometime in the early spring. Grant insisted on holding her hand through the entire examination, hovering at her shoulder with an anxious intensity that made the doctor chuckle and finally shoo him out to the waiting room so he could finish his work in peace. "He's going to be unbearable for the next 7 months," Mara told the doctor, only half joking. "They usually are," Dr. Reyes said, smiling. "Best of luck to you both, Mrs. Mercer. You've earned a bit of good news from what I understand of this past year." It was, Mara thought, walking out to where Grant paced anxiously in the waiting room, the first time in longer than she could remember that someone in this town had said something kind to her without an edge underneath it, without calculation, without anything but plain, ordinary goodwill. She found, standing there in the doctor's small waiting room with her husband's face lighting up the moment he saw her smile, that she could finally, fully believe the worst of it really was behind her. But it is The months that followed brought their own particular kind of healing, slower and quieter than the dramatic confrontations of the spring, but no less real for their quietness. Grant rebuilt what the council's campaign had cost him, piece by careful piece. New grazing agreements signed with ranchers who'd quietly come around, the railroad spur negotiations reopening in October when the county commissioners, facing pressure from enough disgruntled constituents, agreed to reconsider the original route through Hollis Ridge after all. It wasn't a full recovery, not by autumn, not even by the time the first snow dusted the ridgeline in November. But it was enough to keep the ranch solid, enough to plan for a future that included, now, a child who would grow up never knowing the particular cruelty his parents had survived to bring him into the world. Mara, for her part, found herself slowly, almost reluctantly, becoming part of the town's fabric again, in ways she hadn't expected and wasn't entirely sure how to feel about. Mrs. Calloway began setting aside the good flour for her without being asked. 2 of the women who'd once crossed the street to avoid her began stopping to ask after her health, after the pregnancy, with what seemed like genuine warmth rather than obligation. Even Florence Whitaker, in October, appeared at her door one gray afternoon with a basket of preserves and an expression that looked almost, though not quite, like humility. "I won't pretend the past year reflects well on me," Florence said stiffly, standing on Mara's porch with the basket held out before her like an offering she wasn't entirely sure would be accepted. "I told myself at the time that I was protecting this town's standards. I've had a great deal of time since to reconsider what that actually meant and whose standards I was truly protecting." Mara studied her for a long moment. This woman who'd warned her off Grant in the rain outside the dry goods store, who'd stood in the church doorway with Driscoll's counsel, whose sharp tongue had drawn blood more times than Mara cared to count over the past 2 years. "Thank you for the preserves," she said finally, taking the basket. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, not yet, but it wasn't nothing either. "Would you like to come in? I've got coffee on." Florence's eyes widened slightly, clearly not expecting the invitation, and something in her stiff posture eased just slightly with what looked like genuine relief. "I'd like that very much, actually." They sat together at Mara's kitchen table, the same table where Grant had once knelt with flour on his hands and later knelt again with a question that changed everything, and talked, carefully at first and then more easily, about nothing of particular consequence, the way 2 women who'd once been something like acquaintances slowly, tentatively, felt their way back toward something that might one day resemble friendship. It wasn't the kind of reconciliation Mara would have predicted a year earlier, But she'd learned over these past difficult months that people were rarely all one thing, that even Florence Whitaker, sharp-tongued and self-righteous as she'd been, was also a woman capable of looking honestly at her own conduct and finding it wanting, and capable, too, of the harder work of trying to do better. Walter Driscoll never came to apologize. Not directly. Not in any form Mara would have recognized as genuine. But he stopped his campaign entirely after the town meeting in July. And by winter, word reached the ranch that he'd quietly stepped back from the council altogether, citing his health, though most folks in town understood the real reasons well enough. Some battles, Mara had come to understand, didn't end in clean reconciliation. Some simply ended, the aggressor fading from relevance rather than ever truly admitting fault, and she found she could live with that. Not every wound needed a formal apology to finally close. Some just needed time, and the slow, ordinary passage of a life lived well despite everything. The baby came in early March, a little later than Dr. Reyes had predicted, during a late-season snowstorm that had Grant nearly beside himself with worry by the time labor actually started. He paced the hallway outside the bedroom for 11 hours, according to Cole, who'd ridden out in the storm to fetch the doctor and stayed to keep Grant from wearing a groove clean through the floorboards. And when Dr. Reyes finally emerged to tell him he had a daughter, healthy and loud and already furious at the world, Grant reportedly sat down hard on the hallway floor and wept like a man who'd been holding his breath for an entire year. They named her Caroline Daniel Mercer, Caroline for Grant's first wife, Daniel for Mara's, a deliberate choice neither of them had to discuss at length, because both of them understood by now that love didn't require erasing what came before it. Grief and joy could share the same house, the same table, the same small, fierce new life, sleeping in a cradle Grant had built himself over the winter, late at night after the ranch work was done. His hands steady and careful in a way that reminded Mara, every time she watched him work on it, of the same careful hands that had once learned, clumsily and patiently, to crimp a pie crust at her kitchen table. "She's got your stubbornness already," Grant said one evening in late March, watching Mara try, with limited success, to get their daughter to settle for the night. "Won't sleep unless things are exactly the way she wants them." "She's got your impatience," Mara countered, laughing despite her exhaustion. "Wants everything solved immediately, no waiting." "Sounds like a fair trade," Grant said, leaning over to press a kiss to Mara's temple, then to the top of their daughter's downy head. "I can live with that." The spring that followed felt, to Mara, like something closer to the life she'd once believed, in her darkest months after Daniel's death, she would never get to have again. Caroline grew the way babies did, in fits and starts that seemed glacial in the moment and impossibly fast in retrospect. And the ranch hummed along through calving season and planting and all the ordinary, unglamorous work that made up the bulk of a life lived on land like Grant's. Mara found herself more often than not simply happy, not in the dramatic, sweeping way she might once have imagined happiness, but in the quiet, accumulated way of small good mornings stacked one after another into something that finally resembled peace. December came around again, faster than Mara would have believed possible, the whole year having passed in what felt like both an eternity and an instant, and with it came the Christmas basket auction, same as it had every year of Mara's adult life. The town hall decked in the same ribbons and holly, the same long tables set up at the front of the room, the same scent of wood smoke and cooked food and cheap cologne filling the air. Mara hadn't planned to enter this year. The thought, frankly, hadn't even occurred to her until Grant brought it up himself, one evening in early December, Caroline asleep in her arms while he sat across the kitchen table with a thoughtful expression she'd learned to recognize as the precursor to one of his ideas. "You should enter the basket auction this year," he said. Mara looked up at him, surprised. "Grant, I haven't even thought about that. It's been—" "I know what it's been," Grant said gently. "I was there for most of it. That's exactly why I think you should enter." "Why would I want to put myself through that again?" Mara asked, though even as she said it, she felt something stirring underneath the question, something that wasn't quite as resistant to the idea as her words suggested. "Last year nearly broke me, Grant." "Last year," Grant said, reaching across the table to take her free hand. A room full of cruel, frightened people laughed at a woman they decided didn't deserve kindness. "This year, that same woman is going to walk back into that hall as my wife, with our daughter on her hip, and show every single person in that room exactly what they tried and failed to destroy. He squeezed her hand. I think you should enter, Mara, not because you need to prove anything to them. You don't, not anymore. But because I think it might be good for you, for both of us, to walk back into that room and choose, deliberately, to stand in the same spot where they hurt you and feel something other than fear standing there. Mara was quiet for a long moment, considering it, turning the idea over in her mind the way she might turn over a piece of dough, testing its give. And if it goes wrong? If I stand up there again and it's silence again, and it won't be, Grant said with a certainty that made her almost believe him outright. But even if some small piece of it stings, Mara, even if there's one cruel joke from somebody who never learned better, I'll be sitting right there, same as I was last year. And I promise you, I will outbid every single person in that hall again, $50 or $500, it doesn't matter to me. I will stand up in front of this entire town and remind them, every single year if I have to, exactly what they almost let slip through their fingers. Mara felt tears prick at her eyes, the familiar, helpless rush of emotion that came whenever Grant said something so plainly, so entirely without artifice, that it landed harder than any flowery declaration ever could have. All right, she said finally, laughing through the tears. All right, I'll enter. Try. The morning of the auction dawned clear and cold, much like it had a year earlier, frost silvering the windows of the small house Mara still sometimes thought of as her own, even though she'd moved her whole life out to the ranch with Grant the previous spring. She woke before dawn, the old habit never quite leaving her, and found herself in the kitchen by candlelight, flour dust hanging in the air the way it had a year ago, though everything else about the morning felt entirely different. This time Grant was beside her, sleeves rolled up, attempting, with considerably more skill than he'd shown a year earlier, to help with the biscuits, while Caroline slept in a basket by the warm stove, occasionally stirring with small, sleepy sounds that made both her parents pause, whatever they were doing, to check on her. Remember the first time I tried to make these? Grant asked, working the dough with careful, practiced hands. You murdered it, Mara said, smiling at the memory, like it had personally wronged you. I've improved, Grant said, with a mock-offended air that made Mara laugh. You have, she agreed, though I think it took you longer to learn gentle than it should have. Some things take practice, Grant said, glancing over at her with an expression that carried far more weight than the simple words suggested. I'd say it was worth every clumsy attempt, though, given where it got me. They packed the basket together, chicken, fresh bread, the apple pie with its careful lattice top that Mara had perfected over a year of Saturday afternoons spent teaching her husband patience he hadn't known he possessed, and a small jar of Florence Whitaker's preserves, included not out of obligation, but because Mara had genuinely come to enjoy the woman's company over the past several months, an unlikely friendship neither of them would have predicted a year earlier. The walk into town felt different, too. A year ago, Mara had walked these streets alone, head down, bracing herself for whatever cruelty the day held in store. This time, she walked beside her husband, their daughter bundled warm against the cold morning in Grant's arms, and the town that greeted them. Not perfectly, not without the occasional lingering coolness from a handful of people who'd never quite come around, felt, on the whole, like a town that had finally, however reluctantly, made room for her. Morning, Mrs. Mercer. Mrs. Calloway called from the dry goods store doorway as they passed, her smile genuine in a way it hadn't been a year earlier. And little Caroline, my, hasn't she grown? Morning, Mrs. Calloway, Mara replied, and found that the smile she returned cost her nothing at all, none of the careful effort it used to take. The town hall filled the same way it had the year before, baskets lined up along the front tables, children weaving between rows of chairs. The particular festive chaos of a community gathering for a tradition it took genuine pride in. Mara set her basket down among the others, not at the end of the table this time, not hidden away in the spot reserved for someone who expected to be unwanted, but right in the middle, beside Ruth Pemberton's, who greeted her with a warm hello and an admiring comment about Caroline's bright eyes. Higgins took the podium a little after 10, same gray mustache, same borrowed megaphone, same enthusiasm for the proceedings that had carried him through 30 years of calling this auction. Now, folks, he announced, you know how this works. Every dollar goes toward the schoolhouse roof, so dig deep. The auction proceeded much as it always had, basket after basket, finding eager bidders, young couples blushing through good-natured ribbing from the crowd, the room warm with the particular noise of a small town enjoying itself. Mara sat beside Grant near the front this year, Caroline asleep against her shoulder, and found, watching the familiar ritual unfold, that she could finally observe it without the old defensive bracing she'd carried into this hall for 2 consecutive years. When Higgins finally reached her basket, lifting it with the same theatrical flourish he gave every basket, and read the small card tucked beneath the ribbon, Mara felt Grant's hand find hers, steady and certain. "Mrs. Mara Mercer," Higgins announced. And this time the room didn't go quiet with cruel anticipation. This time, a ripple of warm laughter and good-natured calls ran through the hall, several people already glancing toward Grant with knowing smiles, anticipating exactly what was about to happen. "Who'll start the bidding?" Higgins asked, grinning beneath his mustache. "I'll bid $100, Grant called out, standing, and the hall erupted into laughter and applause. Nothing like the awkward, halting silence of a year earlier. Several voices called out good-natured protests. "That's not even a real auction if nobody else bids, Mercer." And Grant laughed, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Fine," he said. "Let somebody else try then. I'll just have to outbid them." A young rancher near the back, clearly enjoying the joke, called out a counterbid of 110, prompting more laughter, and for a few minutes the bidding became its own kind of spectacle, the whole room invested now in watching Grant Mercer cheerfully defend his right to buy his own wife's basket, the price climbing in a way that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with the community, finally choosing to celebrate rather than mock. $200, Grant finally called, when the bidding reached 150, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "And that's my final word, because I've got a daughter at home who needs feeding and a wife who's about to fall asleep standing up holding her." The hall broke into warm applause, Higgins laughing as he brought down his gavel. "Sold to Mr. Mercer for the 2nd year running." Mara felt tears welling up again, but they were entirely different tears than the ones she'd cried in this same hall a year earlier. Not the hot, humiliated tears of a woman being laughed at, but something fuller, something that carried within it the whole impossible distance she'd traveled in 12 months. From a widow, nobody wanted, to a wife and mother sitting in a room full of people who'd finally, however imperfectly, found their way to seeing her. Grant made his way through the crowd to where she sat, accepting handshakes and good-natured ribbing along the way, and when he reached her, he leaned down and kissed her gently, right there in front of the whole hall, with none of the furtive caution that had characterized their earliest days together. "Told you," he murmured against her temple. "Every year, if I have to, have." "You don't have to anymore," Mara said softly, looking around the hall at the warm, ordinary chaos of a town, simply enjoying its own tradition. "I think they finally see it, what you saw first." "Maybe," Grant said, "or maybe it just took them this long to deserve seeing it." He looked down at Caroline, still sleeping peacefully despite the noise around them, and something in his weathered face softened into an expression of pure, uncomplicated contentment. "Either way, I'm glad we're here, all 3 of us." They stayed through the rest of the auction, through the closing remarks and the announcement of the year's total raised for the schoolhouse roof, through the slow, warm dissolution of the crowd into smaller knots of conversation as people gathered their baskets and their families and began the walk home through the cold December afternoon. Florence Whitaker stopped by to admire Caroline properly, exclaiming over her dark eyes, Grant's eyes, unmistakably. And Ruth Pemberton invited them to a small gathering she was hosting before Christmas, an invitation extended with none of the careful distance Mara remembered from a year earlier. Walking home that evening, the sky deepening into the particular violet blue of a winter dusk, Mara found herself thinking back over the whole strange, difficult, ultimately redemptive arc of the past year. The nickel bid and the $50 bid that followed it, the Saturday afternoons full of flour and bad bread slowly turning good, the letter demanding she vacate her own home, the dead crow on her porch, the church doors bursting open on her wedding morning, the long, grinding months of watching her husband's livelihood bleed out one terminated contract at a time. And then, slowly, the turning. Hendricks standing up in that town meeting, Reverend Whitfield's unflinching sermon, Florence Whitaker on her porch with a basket of preserves, and an expression that finally looked like honesty. She thought about what she would tell Caroline someday, when her daughter was old enough to understand the story of how her parents had found each other and what it had cost them to stay together. Not a story about a town that had been cruel, full stop, though it had been cruel, undeniably, for longer than Mara would ever fully forgive. But something more complicated than that, something closer to the truth. A story about how people, even whole communities of them, were capable of real and lasting unkindness, and also sometimes capable of finding their way back from it, slowly, imperfectly, when somebody refused to simply disappear and somebody else refused to let her stand alone. "What are you thinking about?" Grant asked, glancing over at her as they walked, Caroline now awake and watching the darkening sky with the wide, unfocused wonder of a baby encountering the world for the first time. "About everything that got us here," Mara said. "About how close I came a year ago to believing I didn't matter to anyone, to believing that was just going to be the rest of my life. Lonely, mocked, invisible." "And now?" Grant asked quietly. Mara looked at him, at this man who'd ridden into her life on the strength of a debt he'd carried for 3 years, who'd knelt clumsily at her kitchen table and learned to be gentle with pie crust, because gentleness didn't come naturally to him. But he'd been willing to practice it anyway, who'd stood in a church doorway and chosen her, plainly and completely, in front of every person who'd ever doubted she was worth choosing, and felt the whole weight of the past year settle into something she finally understood as simple, hard-won gratitude. "Now I think," she said slowly, "that the people who try hardest to convince you that you're nothing are usually the ones most frightened of what you'd become if you ever believed otherwise. I spent 2 years thinking this town's cruelty meant something true about my worth. It didn't. It only ever meant something true about them, about how easy it is for people to mistake meanness for strength, right up until somebody refuses to disappear and forces them to see the difference." Grant was quiet for a moment, considering that, his arm warm around her shoulders as they walked the last stretch toward home. The ranch house coming into view now, golden lamplight glowing in the windows where Cole had lit the fires before riding back to his own small cabin for the night. "I think," he said finally, "that's about the truest thing I've ever heard you say." "I had a year to think about it," Mara said, smiling. "Seemed worth getting right." They walked the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, the cold December air sharp and clean around them, Caroline's small sounds of contentment the only conversation either of them needed, and when they finally stepped through their own front door into the warmth of the fire Cole had built, Mara felt fully and completely the particular piece of a woman who had built, through grief and stubbornness and one staggering act of unexpected kindness, through every cruel word this town had ever thrown at her and every quiet act of defiance that had carried her through it, exactly the life she had once believed, in her darkest hour, she would never get to have again. She was no longer the woman the town mocked. She was no longer waiting for anyone's permission to belong. She was simply, finally, home. And whatever Cedar Hollow had once tried to convince her she wasn't worth, she had long since stopped needing them to take back the words. She had built something sturdier than their approval ever could have been. A family, a home, and a quiet, unshakable certainty that she had never, not for one single day, deserved any less.